Welcome back to The Common Good, our weekly talk show that will give you insight into what's most important in the daily and weekly political firestorm. Today, Trump's latest outrage, Bernie pulling ahead, the establishment in a panic mode, and a potential pandemic. So buckle up. And if you like what we're doing here, please consider subscribing to our channel. Now, Trump is now attacking not only journalists and members of Congress who disagree with him, but also justices of the Supreme Court, who he's telling to recuse themselves from decisions involving him. He's even picking on individual jurors in Roger Stone's trial, calling them out in tweets and potentially causing them to fear for their physical safety. Folks, we've never seen this sort of behavior before in a president, but Trump is now emboldened to trample on the Constitution thanks to the Republican lackeys that got him through impeachment. Meanwhile, Democrats' inter-party spats and belligerence toward each other was on full display on the debate stage in South Carolina Tuesday night. It was essentially Bernie on stage with 6 other candidates who seemed to want to do nothing more than take potshots at him. The Democratic establishment is piling on Bernie as he's emerged as the candidate to beat and is on his way to getting a plurality of the delegates at the Democratic convention. Now, we'll know far more after Super Tuesday next week, but many Democratic insiders have already hit the panic button. They keep conjuring up fears of 1972. When progressive candidate George McGovern was defeated handily by Richard Nixon, you remember. It's simply asinine for these pundits and power players, who, by the way, were all dead wrong about 2016, to compare Bernie to George McGovern and to warn of a rout. They continue to view American politics through the outmoded lenses of left versus right. With Bernie on the far left and Trump on the far right, so-called moderates, such as Bloomberg and Buttigieg, supposedly occupy the political center, appealing to a broader swath of the electorate. This may have been the correct frame for politics decades ago, when America still had a growing middle class, but it's obsolete today. As wealth and power have moved to the top and middle class has shrunk, more Americans feel politically disempowered and economically insecure. Today's main divide is not left versus right, it's establishment versus anti-establishment. Trump continues to pose as an anti-establishment populist. It's one of the biggest cons in American political history. Since his election, he has given the denizens of C-suites and boardrooms almost everything they have wanted and hasn't improved the lives of his working-class supporters, even if his politically incorrect, in-your-face style continues to make many feel as if he's taking on the system. The best way for Democrats to defeat Trump's fake anti-establishment populism is with the real thing, coupled with an agenda of systemic reform. And this is what Bernie offers, as does Elizabeth Warren. So where are we in this epic battle for the soul of America? Young people are a critical force, so let's check in with perennial millennial Katie Milne.
Hi, Bob. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Lots to talk about.
Lots to talk about. So let's dive in. So today, the overarching theme that we're going to get into is the establishment freakout about Bernie Sanders and his movement. But before we get into that, I just want to establish some baseline terms. So what exactly is the establishment?
Well, the establishment. Well, I know because I was there, and I was, when you're in the cabinet of a president, you're sort of part of the establishment. The establishment really is the power centers of America. That is mostly New York and Washington, to a lesser extent, the Peninsula, San Francisco Bay. But you've got very wealthy, very powerful people who, and all of their retinue, all of their advisors and all the political consultants and all the public relations people and all the people who are the lawyers for them. So you've got, as more and more wealth and power goes to the top, and as it has over the last several decades, the establishment doesn't necessarily get larger. It just means it gets wealthier and more powerful. And there's always been an establishment, but it really does run a lot of America right now.
Okay, great. So now that we've got that baseline established for our viewers, let's dive into it. So Bernie Sanders was the clear, decisive victor of the Nevada caucus last Saturday, and the establishment
doesn't want him.
Saturday
No.
for alarm fire. I mean, you had
They're freaking out.
Yeah, you had the MSNBC coverage just going absolutely off the wall. I mean, Nicole Wallace called his diverse coalition that powered him to victory a squeaky, angry minority.
Now, it's interesting that MSNBC, which is, of all the major cable networks, MSNBC is to the left of the left. MSNBC is pretty much anti-Bernie. Not every
Clearly.
one of them, but a lot of them are anti-Bernie. And you've got to wonder, I mean, I think several of them have had experience in Democratic administrations before, Lawrence O'Donnell and Chris Matthews. But you also have maybe, and I'm just guessing on the basis of what I've observed, a corporate culture at Infinity, Comcast, so on, that is not terribly comfortable with what they fear is a socialist.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the corporate media is the role of the media is to be gatekeepers. The media decides what we talk about and how we think about it. So I think the corporate media, they're gatekeepers of the status quo, and Bernie Sanders obviously threatens that status quo.
Which is actually why he's so attractive to so many people.
Exactly.
Because it's the status quo and it's the establishment that really has attracted so much anti-establishment feeling as the establishment gets more and more powerful. And this is Trump's trick. I mean, Trump created the impression that he was anti-establishment, that he was populist, anti-mainstream media, and anti-corporate. But of course, he's given corporations, including big media corporations, everything they wanted. Big tax cuts, regulatory rollbacks, and all of the publicity you could imagine.
Yeah, Trump's rhetorical strategy during his campaign to portray himself as anti-establishment and man of the people was a huge, as you said in the opening monologue, one of the biggest cons in American political history.
He's still doing it.
Oh, 100%.
I mean, he's still, every one of his rallies, every one of his tweets, he's trying to present himself as a man of the people, as anti-establishment. And in the back rooms, of course, he's doing everything that the establishment wants.
Exactly. So first, when Bernie won, there was the media freak out on MSNBC. And then he had a tweet that caused all of these center-left Democratic power players to clutch their pearls and proclaim he was so divisive. He said something along the lines of, the Republican establishment can't stop our movement, and neither can the Democratic establishment.
And that was he declared war.
Oh my God! Well, sound the alarms.
Because again, if you think of the main political divide, not horizontally left to right, but vertically, establishment versus anti-establishment, then Bernie is the major. He's the real anti-establishment candidate versus Trump's fake anti-establishment candidate. I think Elizabeth Warren is too, but not quite as vociferously, not quite as blatantly.
Yeah.
Did you see Tuesday night when at that one moment when Bloomberg was talking about his money and he said, no, I'm not a Republican, I've bought, and then he stopped himself, but everybody heard him say, I bought Democrats.
Yeah, and he believes that. So I think this just goes to show how out of touch the political establishment is. And it's because the way that things used to work just isn't how it works anymore. I mean, we've talked about how the left versus right divide is obsolete. It's really about democracy versus oligarchy, this multi-class, multiracial coalition against a few people at the top who can pull all the strings.
But the oligarchy, let's stick to that term for a minute. They do want everybody below them in the bottom 60%, bottom 70% to be at each other's necks and throats. I mean, they really do want a lot of divisiveness because otherwise people will wake up, and I'm talking about the white working class and the black working class and middle class and poor people. They'll wake up and men and women, they'll wake up and they'll say, wait a minute, we have a lot more in common. And it's, if you want to know where all the wealth and power are in this country, they've gone to the top. Let's stop squabbling and let's unite against them and get some of that wealth and power back. That's what Bernie Sanders is trying to do in terms of forming a coalition.
Yes.
And to a lesser extent, Elizabeth Warren. And that's what the establishment is really afraid of.
They are terrified. And it's funny how when Bloomberg was surging and all the progressives were like, hey, he's actually a terrible person and you shouldn't vote for him and you shouldn't support him. All of the moderates were calling for unity behind the eventual nominee. But now that Bernie's the front runner, all of a sudden, they have to stop Bernie and stop his candidacy. And one of the ways that they're has been talked about that they're trying to do that is through a brokered or a contested convention.
Well, it's very likely that we are going to have a contested
So what's
convention.
the difference between a brokered and contested convention? Because those terms have kind of gotten thrown around in the media, but I think it's important to hammer home what the differences are.
Yeah, they're very different. A contested convention is when you go into a convention, no individual candidate has a majority of the delegates. So there's not already basically a nominee. But a brokered convention happens when after the first ballot, there still is no nominee. After the first ballot, the first voting in the convention, there's still no majority for any individual person. And at that point, and this is the very significant point, at that point, every delegate is released from his or her pledge, can vote for anybody, and all the superdelegates. Now, remember that in 2016, the Democratic superdelegates threw it all to Hillary Clinton. The superdelegates, they changed that. Superdelegates now don't have a first vote. But on the second vote, if there is a brokered convention, the superdelegates can now all participate. And that's where the action is going to happen, because Bloomberg has essentially bought off a lot of the superdelegates and even some of the delegates with all his money over the years. He's spread it around, as he almost said, bought off, and that's what he's counting on.
Yeah, and I think some of the other candidates are actually counting on that too, because last week, this kind of flew under the radar, but in last week's debate in Nevada, when asked about the nominating convention, Bernie Sanders was the only candidate to say that, the candidate with the most votes and most delegates should be the nominee.
Most, not the majority.
Yeah,
he said the most. And everybody else said, no, let the process play out. What they really meant by let the process play out is let there be a brokered convention, let the deals be made in the back rooms, let the superdelegates and the delegates who are released from because it's already after the first vote, released from their pledges, let them work it out. In other words, let the anti-democratic forces decide.
Right. So if I'm understanding this correctly, what the Democratic establishment is counting on is if Bernie Sanders has a plurality of delegates going into it, the Democratic establishment and all of those other candidates on the stage, they want to throw the superdelegates, which are all the party insiders and the political power players. They want all of the superdelegates to band together and take the nomination away from Bernie Sanders.
Yes, and here's where history...
Can't imagine that.
Wait,
that sounds
Katie,
great.
But this is where history plays a very important role, because they're all worried, and I understand they're worried. The establishment is worried in the Democratic Party about a repeat of 1972, when George McGovern basically lost every state. He was too far left. He lost every state except Massachusetts. But we're not back in 1972. In 1972, we had a large and growing middle class. We didn't have the anti-establishment movement we now have. I think what Democrats need to be more aware of is 1968, because it was 1968 where they nominated somebody that most of the Democrats didn't want, and that was Hubert Humphrey. Most delegates and most of the individuals, most voters actually wanted an anti-war candidate in 1968. They didn't get it, and that split the Democratic Party for almost a generation. And that's the danger. If the rigging happens.
And that's literal rigging, not, just in a kind of metaphorical top-level sense.
This is literal. If the establishment Democrats literally rig it so that there's a brokered convention, and then in the back rooms of the brokered convention, it goes to Bloomberg or even Biden, then you could have another 1968.
Yeah, and I think if the Democratic Party ends up using that as their strategy, they will not have a leg to stand on. I mean, voters are already distrustful of the process. They already think the system is rigged against them. They already think these Washington insiders have too much power over their daily lives, and that will just confirm all of those feelings. And I think if the Democrats torpedo Bernie's nomination and swing it to Bloomberg through the use of a brokered convention and superdelegates, I mean, how can voters ever trust the Democratic Party? And how can they trust in democracy at all?
In a way, it's also a repeat of 2016, because you had a lot of Bernie voters feel that the superdelegates and the convention threw it to the establishment because Hillary Clinton, she couldn't help but be part of the establishment. So there is that danger of people staying home, particularly young people.
Yeah, so that is the primary recap for the week. And then in other news, in terms of more of a global sense, the coronavirus is really becoming a bigger threat. There have been cases spreading to Europe and other parts of Asia, and the CDC has been issuing warnings for Americans to stay on alert. There have been a couple cases recorded here. And the Trump administration is going around claiming everything's fine and they've got it under control. So,
well, I can understand the Trump administration saying everything is fine and under control. They don't want people to panic, and that may be a responsible position. What's not responsible is not being prepared. They have the Trump budget cut the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. Trump's HHS, Health and Human Services, is not prepared at all. They don't have the personnel. They don't have the budget. It's one thing to say to the public, don't be overly concerned. It's another thing not to be prepared. And I'm really worried about their lack of preparedness.
Yeah, I think the Trump administration has made a couple of deliberate choices, and now they are dangerously unprepared for this moment. I mean, they in 2014, the Obama administration created a position on the National Security Council to deal with global pandemics like this. It was created in response to the Ebola outbreak. And in 2018, the White House got rid of that position, and Trump has an acting director of national intelligence, an acting secretary of Homeland Security, an acting White House chief of staff. And he is in the middle of this loyalty purge with all of his administration officials. So he's woefully unprepared for this. And the fact that he and his top economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, are going around saying, we've got it handled, it's fine, the markets are fine, this, that, and the other. I don't think they're trying to keep the public calm. They're deliberately declaring that it's not an issue.
And they're worried about the markets. That's what they're worried about. Instead of public health, which is what they really should be worried about, they are worried about what Donald Trump thinks is the most important thing, and that is what happens to the stock market. And that's absurd.
Mm-hmm. So how do you see the coronavirus affecting the economy, both at the national level and globally? Are we headed for a recession? How is this going to play into Trump's reelection chances?
Well, of course, the number one concern is a public health concern. As it grows, there is definitely an ancillary set of effects. The economy, the stock market is taking a beating, and it's taking a beating mainly because the United States is so intimately related to the rest of the world. If the rest of the world is shut down, China is the second biggest economy in the world. Our major trading partners, the second biggest trading partner is Europe. If Europe begins to respond, and if China is shutting down or shrinking as an economy, obviously it's going to have huge impacts in the United States. And you also have all of these supply chains for all of these companies like Apple, the big tech. They all come from Asia. And it's not just China, it's also South Korea and Japan. And as those South Korea and Japan also start shutting down, all of those supply chains are in jeopardy. And so you're going to see more and more of an economic response.
Got it. And so what do you think the administration's response is going to be when this gets too bad to put any positive spin on it? What are they going to do?
Well, Trump is a master at deflecting blame. He will blame somebody else. He will say, well, the Fed should have cut interest rates faster, or it's China, and if anybody had paid attention to me and we cut off all trade with blah, 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 and all personnel, and I was the one who said anybody with the virus even if Americans, should not have been left off that ship, and I'm firing people who, he'll do his Trump thing, which is blame everybody else instead of taking responsibility. This is the opposite of the famous Harry Truman quote, "The buck stops with me." With Trump, the buck stops with everybody else.
With everyone else, yeah. So we'll keep an eye on this, but it is really nerve-wracking. I think the whole world is on edge right now with this going on.
Well, it's there's a stress factor that everybody is feeling. It's not just the coronavirus, obviously. It's also climate change, and it's Trump. Put all that together, there is just in the atmosphere, there is a huge amount of stress that people are feeling and expressing in their everyday lives. I mean, look at road rage. I've never seen as much road rage, seriously.
Interesting.
And you see hate crimes soaring.
Yeah.
I mean, all of these are examples of a society under greater stress.
Yeah. Well, something I like to do when I'm under greater stress is I like to unwind by reading a book. And as you can see behind us, we have a lot of people have been asking us to dive into some of the books we've got behind us. So today's our first inaugural segment about our book club. So do you want to get started?
Well, the book club, the idea of the book club is that we were just basically enchanted by certain books. They don't have to be books that are necessarily books that are bestsellers right now, but they're books that we think you probably ought to take a look at. You have a pick. I have a pick. What's your pick?
So my pick is Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas. I read this book over the summer, actually right before I started working here, and it's my favorite book I've read in a really long time. And I wanted to reread it again after working here for for about 6 months. And if you want to understand where this anti-establishment sentiment is coming from, and if you want to understand the conversation about wealth and billionaires and power and who has it and who doesn't, I could not recommend this book enough. I mean, it totally changed the way I think about philanthropy and the power structure and neoliberalism and the failed policies that have gotten to where we are today. So I could not recommend this enough. And Anand, he was just on MSNBC over the weekend. He had a truly brilliant take on why the establishment was freaking out about Bernie Sanders. So I recommend everyone checking out that clip. He talked about how if you, as a member of the media, if your mental models don't click with what's happening in the political world, you don't just discount what's happening, you change your mental models, and you have to have a sense of curiosity about why you're not understanding the political movement of this time. So he's an amazing thought leader. I follow him on Twitter. Also would recommend that. He's a really amazing thinker, and I couldn't recommend this book enough.
I thought the book was terrific as well. And he and I are going to be, at the end of March, we're going to be on stage together because he's going to be promoting his book, and I'm going to be promoting mine.
Do you have a book coming out?
I have a book coming out, but we won't talk about it now. The book that I wanted to recommend was a book that's a little bit older. It was actually published in 1899.
Oh, that's when you were born,
yes,
right?
I was born. No, I was born in 1896. But this 1899 book is an important book. It's called The Theory of the Leisure Class by a man named Thorstein Veblen. And I'm going to bring a copy in. My goal is just to get it reprinted. I mean, if you want to see, it's very hard to get a hold of. But it's one of the most important volumes that describe what happened in the Gilded Age of the 1880s, 1890s, when wealth and power went to the top. We're now in a second Gilded Age. And so if you want to understand the second Gilded Age, it's very important to understand the first one. And there's no better key to the first Gilded Age than Thorstein Veblen and the Theory of the Leisure Class.
Got it. Well, I will make sure to check it out while I'm rereading Winners Take All. And that is all we have for this week. I will see you next week.
Thank you, Katie. Trump is more unhinged and uncontrolled than ever, feeling immunized against impeachment and unaccountable for his actions. The Democratic primary is coming to a head. The coronavirus is spreading across the world. A deep recession is certainly possible. The election is still over 8 months away, and anything can happen. These are dangerous and difficult times. There may not be much you can do to control the economy or a pandemic, but you can control Trump if you pitch in. So please be an active citizen, be involved in the primaries, knock on doors for your candidate, make phone calls, make sure you and your family and friends are all registered to vote. Check your registration at vote.gov, make a plan for how and when you're going to vote, and dance your way to the voting booths or to the mailbox where you mail in your ballots. Keep up the fight, keep the faith. See you next week.